My best friend always says I'm copying him. My name is Noah Riley, and I used to believe that loyalty was stronger than pride. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Ethan's Way. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. Mason and I met when we were 10 years old. We were the same height, same messy hair, same scrappy energy. We bonded over the most random things, drawing comics in the back of class, skateboarding on cracked sidewalks, staying up late watching horror movies we weren't allowed to see. For years it felt like we were two halves of the same creative soul. That's why I didn't notice it at first, the way he'd grit his teeth when someone complimented my work, or the way he'd smirk and say, "Guess I'm rubbing off on you," whenever I tried something new. Back then I took it as affection, a joke between brothers. After all, wasn't imitation the sincerest form of flattery? But it changed as we got older. In high school, I chose to take digital art as an elective. He'd already been in the class for a year, and when I joined, he made a big deal about it. "Of course you picked that. You always go where I go." I laughed. I thought he was joking, but it kept happening. He picked up guitar. I did a few months later. He called me a copycat. He started wearing all black outfits, and when I did too, because I liked the look, he rolled his eyes and said, "Originality isn't your strong suit, huh?" Still, I didn't take it seriously. I chalked it up to competitive banter. That's what close friends did, right? Push each other, rib each other a little. It wasn't until college that things started to really sting. We went to different schools, but kept in touch. I was studying design. He was already freelancing on the side. I remember sending him one of my first poster mock-ups for feedback, and his reply was 2 words, "Looks familiar." That hurt more than I let on, but I told myself it was just my sensitivity. Mason was always blunt. That didn't mean he didn't care. When we graduated, we ended up back in the same city, and for a while, it felt good, like old times. We'd meet up at coffee shops and talk about projects, trends, goals. But every time I made a move, booked a client, upgraded my gear, shared a piece I was proud of, he had a comment ready. Didn't I already do something like that? Funny how you're always one step behind. I started second-guessing everything. There was one time I bought a pair of sneakers once I'd seen in an online ad, not on him, and the first thing he said when I wore them was "nice." I had those last year. It sounds petty. It was petty. But imagine hearing that same tone every single time you tried to express yourself. It wasn't just commentary anymore, it was accusation. And it dug into me, slowly, quietly. I remember one night sitting in my apartment staring at my sketches and wondering, do I even have my own voice, or have I just been echoing him this whole time? That doubt crept into everything I did. And the worst part, I never wanted to be in competition with him. I admired him, genuinely. Maybe that was the problem. Because admiration in his eyes looked a lot like theft. I didn't want to believe it. I kept pushing down that little voice that told me something was off, that maybe my best friend didn't see me as a friend at all, but as a shadow. But denial can only last so long. The turning point, it was coming, and when it hit, I couldn't unsee the truth. We always said we'd build something together. When we were 15, Mason and I came up with the name North Step on a city bus somewhere between a late-night burrito run and a missed curfew. I remember how excited we were, 2 scrappy, overthinking kids with sketchbooks full of half-finished ideas and too much soda in our blood. It wasn't just a name to us. North Step was our vision, our promise. Someday we'd have a creative studio with a skylight exposed brick and a neon sign over the door. But that dream didn't age the same for both of us. After college, we landed in the same city again, not on purpose, just something that happened. He took off fast freelancing with a kind of reckless confidence I never had. Mason was always better at self-promotion, always knew the right people to talk to, at art shows, always said the right edgy thing online. Me, I took the long road. Part-time job at a bookstore by day, gig work by night. Some weeks I was designing logos for dog groomers. Other weeks I was making flyer templates for free just to keep my portfolio from going stale. But I was building, quietly, and at first Mason cheered me on. He'd send me emoji reacts on my Instagram stories. He'd forward me client leads. We'd still grab fries and brainstorm dumb startup names like the old days. Then came the shift small at first, like a cold draft under a locked door. It started when I was tagged in a small design blog. It wasn't anything huge, just a roundup of emerging creatives under 30. I was the 3rd name in a list of 12. But when I showed Mason proud and a little nervous, he barely looked at the screen. "Nice," he muttered. They're always looking for the next version of something that already worked. I blinked. What does that mean? He shrugged. You know how it is. You've always had good taste. You know how to follow what works. That sat with me for days. I replayed his tone over and over. Was he complimenting me? Was it a jab? Why did it feel like both? Then just weeks later, I moved into a new apartment. Nothing fancy, just a downtown loft with big windows and creaky wood floors. I'd found it through a client referral and practically begged the landlord to give me a shot. I was proud of it. It felt like the kind of place I could finally create and not just survive. When Mason visited, he glanced around and said, "Wow, you really do want my life?" Huh, I thought he was joking. He wasn't smiling. "Excuse me," I asked. "I lived in a place like this last year. Same layout, same vibe. It's cool though. It's like you're mirroring me." He said it casually, like it was a compliment, but his girlfriend who came with him that day shot me a glance. One of those awkward, tight-lipped expressions like she was sorry for something she couldn't say out loud. That night, I sat on the floor of my new place and looked around. I had picked out the furniture. I had chosen the color palette. I had designed the prints on the wall, but suddenly, it didn't feel like mine. That's the power of subtle accusations. They make you doubt things you know you chose for yourself. From that moment on, I started second-guessing everything. The color scheme of my newest branding proposal too similar to his last project. The font choices in my website redesign. Maybe he'd used them before. Even the way I photographed my desk, was I mimicking his aesthetic? It was like a sickness, and I didn't even realize I'd caught it until I found myself deleting a post before publishing it, just because it felt too Mason. I still wanted to believe we were just growing in parallel, that we had similar tastes, because we'd always inspired each other, that the overlaps weren't theft but synergy. But then came the whispers. A mutual acquaintance, Sarah, reached out about a potential collaboration. We'd met through a networking event, and she said she admired my clean lines and storytelling-based layouts. We scheduled a call. Everything felt good. Then at the very end of the conversation, she said something that made my stomach twist. "I'm glad I got to talk to you directly. Mason kinda made it sound like you were just a watered-down version of his work, but I see you've got your own rhythm." I froze. She continued, not realizing the depth of the wound. "He said you two used to be really close, so I assumed your stuff was just spin-off. But it's not. You've got a different sensibility, softer, more intentional." I thanked her, hung up, and sat there in silence for a long, long time. So he was saying it out loud, not just to me, not in jest, not in passing. He was telling other people, potential clients, collaborators, that I was copying him, that my work was a spin-off, that I wasn't original. I wish I could say I confronted him right away. I didn't. I wasn't ready. Instead, I withdrew. I stopped posting my process. I kept my projects private. I started working under aliases when pitching to new clients. I thought if I stayed small, he'd stop feeling threatened, that maybe I was somehow feeding the fire, and if I dimmed my light, it would go out. But shrinking doesn't protect you from someone who's determined to see you as a threat. And soon, the next storm was coming. A client we both wanted, a project that would draw the line between us forever. The client was a boutique sneaker brand that had just gone viral on TikTok thread Stomp. They were gritty, artistic, edgy. Their creative director was someone both Mason and I admired from afar. We'd talked about him before over drinks like fans whispering about a myth. So when Thread Stomp put out a call for freelance designers to pitch a rebrand, both of us applied. I found out only because I saw Mason share it on his story with the caption, "Let's see who's really got range." At first I hesitated. I didn't want to be in direct competition with him. I knew how it would look, knew what he'd say, or worse, what he'd imply. But this project, it was everything I'd been working toward. It wasn't just an opportunity, it was a test of whether I was ready to stop hiding, stop flinching, and stop shrinking around him. So I applied. I poured weeks into the concept. Every layout, every mood board, every typeface and texture came from something real. My background, my family's immigrant story, my obsession with urban texture and muted color theory. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, it was deliberate. I sent it off and tried to forget it. Then 2 weeks later, I got the email. Subject line: "We'd love to work with you, Noah." I stared at it in disbelief. My fingers hovered over my keyboard, not knowing what to do. Smile, scream, panic. I didn't tell Mason right away. I didn't want to gloat, and to be honest, I was afraid of what he might say, or how he'd make me feel about it. But of course, He found out. ThreadStomp's creative director posted a behind-the-scenes shot of my concept mock-ups on his story tagging me. 15 minutes later, Mason messaged me. Mason, congrats. Guess they wanted a remix instead of the real thing. I sat there staring at those words like someone had knocked the wind out of me. No emoji, no sarcasm. Just that cold surgical tone he always used when he was truly pissed. I didn't reply, but that wasn't the end. Later that night, I got a DM from a mutual friend, someone we'd both collaborated with in the past. Did you see Mason's story? I hadn't. I opened Instagram and felt my stomach tighten. There it was, a black screen with white text. Some people don't have a voice of their own, just echoes of better minds. Success built on imitation is failure in disguise. He didn't tag me. He didn't have to. The timing was obvious. The subtext was surgical. And the comments, they weren't many, but they stung. Spill the tea, bro. Let these clout leeches know. One of y'all been too quiet, I see it now. I wanted to disappear. But the worst part wasn't the post itself, it was that part of me believed him. I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by my own work, and wondered if I really was a fraud. Was I just recycling pieces of Mason without realizing it? Was all my so-called creativity just mimicry in a nicer font? I didn't sleep. And the next morning when I opened my sketchbook, my hand froze. For the first time in my life, I felt afraid to create. Afraid that no matter what I made, it would be used as evidence against me in his eyes and everyone's eyes. That day, I canceled all my meetings. I went for a walk, wandering the city with my hoodie up, trying to remember why I ever loved this work. That's when I bumped into someone I hadn't seen in years. Tara, an old friend from college who'd gone on to work at an agency in LA. She recognized me instantly. Noah. Wow, I've been following your stuff. You've grown so much. I must have looked surprised because she added, why are you looking at me like I just said the moon's made of cheese? I laughed, a real one, for the first time in days. We got coffee. I didn't mention Mason, but she did casually without any heat. You and Mason's still cool. I know he always had a weird edge when it came to competition, even back in school. I blinked. What do you mean? She stirred her drink. I mean, it always felt like he needed to be the best in the room. Like if someone got too close, he had to push them back down. You didn't see that. I shook my head slowly. She studied me. Noah, you've got your own voice. Always did, you just don't yell about it. That sentence stuck with me. You don't yell about it. Neither did the artists I admired. Neither did the mentors who'd quietly shaped my creative voice. They weren't loud, they weren't defensive, they just kept building. When I got home, I opened that sketchbook again. This time, my hand moved. The doubt was still there, but now it had something new sitting beside it. Clarity. That night, I posted a carousel on Instagram, a few shots of my ThreadStomp work, plus a quiet caption. I used to think creativity was a contest. Now I know it's a conversation. These are my words. No hashtags, no callouts, just truth. And something strange happened. People responded. Not with hype or noise, but with calm, honest engagement. Messages like I've followed both of you. I can tell the difference. Your work has a tenderness. His doesn't. This feels like you. Don't let anyone shrink it. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't victory. But it was the beginning of something stronger. And in that moment, I understood what Mason had never been able to say. It wasn't that I was copying him. It was that I was growing beside him, and he didn't like what that revealed. I thought that after the ThreadStomp project, things would quiet down, that Mason would let go, that we could drift apart peacefully without one final blow. But if I've learned anything about people like him, it's this silence isn't surrender, it's preparation. A few weeks passed. I kept working, kept my head down. The ThreadStomp campaign was going smoothly, and I was finally beginning to feel some distance, not just from Mason, but from that constant urge to prove something. I started waking up without checking my phone first. I stopped bracing myself for subtext and shade. Then came the apartment incident. I just finished a long day meeting with the ThreadStomp team when I got a message from Mason. Hey, near your place. Got time. I hesitated. We hadn't spoken in person since the fallout. I hadn't replied to his passive-aggressive story. I hadn't responded to the text he sent afterward that just said, no hard feelings, man. But I also hadn't closed the door, because deep down, whether I admitted it or not, a part of me still missed him. So I told him to come by. I cleaned up quickly, hiding coffee mugs and stacking papers. I made sure the space looked decent, not flashy, just lived in. When he showed up, he barely looked at me, just walked in like he owned the place. He scanned the apartment with those sharp eyes of his and gave a low whistle. Damn, loft living now, huh? I smiled. Yeah, got lucky with the rent. He nodded, but didn't sit down. Instead, he wandered around the room, running his fingers along the windowsill, glancing at the art I'd pinned on the walls. He stopped in front of one piece, a moody minimal print I'd created in isolation a few months back. I was proud of it, not because it was flashy, but because it felt pure, unfiltered by trends or other people's voices. He tilted his head. Didn't I do something like this last year? There it was, like a slap dressed as a handshake. I didn't answer. He turned to me with a smirk, the kind he used when he wanted to assert dominance but pretend he was joking. I'm just messing with you, man, he added. Don't get so tense. I forced a smile. You know that line's getting old. He blinked. What line? The one where you say I'm copying you. It used to be funny. Now it just feels like you're keeping score. He chuckled, but it was tight. I'm not keeping score. I just call it how I see it. I nodded slowly. Yeah, you always do. Silence settled between us. For a moment I thought he might say something real, something vulnerable. Instead, he looked around again and said, You know what's wild? This place, it feels familiar. Like I've lived here before. I raised an eyebrow. Because you have a loft, because everything here feels like it was pulled from my Pinterest boards. I stared at him. Are you serious? He laughed again, but this time it didn't even pretend to be warm. I mean, come on, Noah. First the style, then the clients, now the aesthetic. What's next? You dating my ex. The words hit like a gut punch, not because they were true, but because they were intentional. He wanted to provoke me. He wanted me to lose my cool, to validate his narrative that I was the shadow and he was the source. But I didn't take the bait. Instead, I asked, why does it bother you so much that we have similar taste? He looked caught off guard. It doesn't. Then why keep pointing it out? Why frame everything I do as derivative? Do you think I'm stealing from you? He didn't answer. I stepped closer. Or is it scarier to admit that maybe we both started from the same place, but I've moved forward, and you haven't? His face hardened. I knew I'd crossed a line, not because I was cruel, but because I'd spoken something he refused to see. We stood there for a moment, both of us breathing hard in the stillness of my apartment. Then he said, You really think you're better than me now, huh? I shook my head. No, I just think I don't need your permission to exist anymore. That was the last thing I said before I asked him to leave. He didn't fight it. He just scoffed, grabbed his jacket, and walked out muttering something about how I'd changed. He was right. I had. But change doesn't always feel like freedom. Sometimes it feels like grief. After he left, I sat down on my couch and stared at the wall for a long time. I wasn't angry. I was tired. Tired of trying to earn someone's respect who never saw me as an equal. Tired of apologizing for my own growth. Tired of carrying guilt for stepping out of someone else's shadow. That night, I made a decision. I was done waiting for him to treat me like a peer. I was going to start treating myself like a creator in my own right, not as a reaction to him, not as a contrast, but as a whole person with a voice. That choice would cost me more than I realized, but it would also save me. They say you don't really lose a friend all at once. It's not a clean break. It's a slow unraveling thread by thread, moment by moment, until one day you look up and realize you're standing alone, holding a frayed end that used to be something whole. After the apartment incident, I expected Mason to ghost me for a while, maybe block me, maybe send a snide remark through a mutual. But he didn't go quiet. Instead, he went public. I didn't see it at first. A former client, someone who had worked with both of us in the past, sent me a screenshot. It was a tweet, not tagged, not explicit, just vague enough to be cowardly and clear enough to be intentional. It's funny how some people think that proximity equals talent. Just because you sat next to me doesn't mean you absorbed the skill. I read it 3 times, my face flushed, my stomach twisted. I wanted to ignore it, wanted to believe I was just being paranoid. But the replies told another story. Someone replied, "Is this about who I think it is?" Mason had liked the comment. Another replied with a gif of a copy machine glitching. Mason retweeted that one. I sat on my floor phone in my hand chest, tight. It was like being back in high school, but worse, because this time I had something to lose. He wasn't just throwing shade. He was actively trying to poison the well. For years I had worked in silence, built relationships, carefully made sure to stay out of drama, keep my head down, let my work speak. But now people were whispering, and the worst part, some believed him. A brand I'd been in talks with suddenly stopped replying. Another asked delicately if I'd ever collaborated with Mason on this kind of design before. The implication was clear. He was painting me as someone who couldn't build on his own, and it was working. That broke something in me. I'd spent so long trying to keep the peace, trying to believe that if I just stayed humble, stayed kind, the truth would protect me. But truth doesn't defend you if you stay silent. So I started digging. I wasn't looking for revenge, not yet, but I needed answers. I needed to know if this was all in my head or if a Mason had been doing this longer than I realized. I reached out to a few mutual collaborators cautiously. One of them, a motion designer named Elias, agreed to meet up. We grabbed coffee on a quiet Tuesday. He looked nervous, like he didn't want to be caught in the middle. I'll be honest, man, he said I didn't want to say anything. But yeah, Mason's been talking. I swallowed. What kind of talking? He exhaled. It's subtle. He never says your name outright, but he'll say stuff like, you know, some people are just good at remixing what I already did. Or, I should start charging a tax for all the work my style has inspired. Things like that. I stared at my cup. He even showed me one of your mood boards once Elias added, hesitating. Said it looked like something he'd done a year ago, and that you were borrowing without credit. I looked up. He's showing people my private work. Elias nodded slowly. Only once that I know of, but it stuck with me. Because honestly, it didn't look like his style at all. I didn't know what to say. Elias leaned forward. Noah, I've worked with both of you. Your work is cleaner, more intentional. He's got flash, you've got story. They're different, but I think he can't see that. That hit me harder than I expected, because I realized something in that moment. This wasn't about design. This wasn't about fonts or mood boards or even clients. It was about identity. Mason had wrapped his entire sense of self around the idea of being the original. And anyone who mirrored even a part of his work, even by coincidence, even unintentionally, was a threat to that fragile crown. It didn't matter how long we'd known each other. It didn't matter how different our voices had become. To him, I wasn't a peer, I was a usurper, and he'd rather destroy me than risk being seen as anything less than the one who started it all. I walked home from that coffee meeting in a daze. My phone buzzed with notifications, but I ignored them. When I got back to my apartment, I pulled out a notebook, not my iPad, not my laptop, and I started writing, not designing, writing. Everything I'd wanted to say for months, maybe years. The moments I brushed off, the comments I excused, the pieces of myself I'd chipped away at trying to avoid being too similar. I wrote until my hand cramped, and when I finished, I realized something. I didn't hate Mason. I pitied him, because while I had been evolving, learning, finding my rhythm, he had been guarding, clutching his identity like a trophy, terrified someone else might shine near him, and that's no way to live. But I also realized I had to protect myself, so I started collecting evidence, screenshots of messages, time-stamped files, mood boards with version histories, not for court, not for drama, but because if anyone tried to question my integrity again, I would be ready. Then quietly, I began preparing for something else. A solo show, not a massive gallery launch, just a small space, local, clean, affordable. I reached out to an events coordinator I trusted. We picked a weekend. I designed the invite myself. I titled the show Unborrowed. It was the most honest thing I could do, not to prove I wasn't a copy, but to never again feel the need to. The gallery space was smaller than I imagined, but perfect in its own way. Concrete floors, tall white walls, and lighting that felt more like sunlight than spotlight. I didn't want anything dramatic. No velvet ropes, no pretentious wine list. Just raw, clear space to let the work breathe. I called it Unborrowed. It was a risk. Not just financially, though. Yes, I had to dip into savings to rent the space and print my pieces at full scale, but emotionally. I knew what it could look like. To anyone watching closely, it might read like a statement, a confrontation, maybe even a jab. But I wasn't doing this against Mason. I was doing it without him. That distinction meant everything to me. I curated 12 pieces, each one representing a different chapter of my creative journey, from the hesitant shapes I first sketched in college to the stripped-down poster style I'd leaned into over the past year. Each piece was deeply personal. One was inspired by my mother's worn-out grocery list. Another came from the way city lights flicker on rain-soaked glass at night. Nothing in this exhibit existed for the sake of aesthetics. Every color, every shadow, every spacing choice was intentional. Mine. I spent weeks preparing, obsessing over the smallest details, the matte finish on the prints, the ambient playlist humming low in the background, even the scent in the room, cedar and ink. The night before the opening, I walked through the gallery alone. No camera, no phone, just me and the art. And for the first time in months, I felt at peace. No competition, no noise, just presence. The night of the opening arrived, and I almost didn't show up. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but I sat in my apartment fully dressed, keys in hand, heart thumping like a bass line in my throat. A small part of me, that old brittle part, whispered, "What if no one comes? What if Mason shows up? What if they all think you're a fraud?" But then I remembered I didn't do this to be validated. I did this to reclaim something. So I stood, exhaled, and went. The gallery was already filling up when I arrived. Old classmates, past clients, Instagram followers I'd never met in real life, all there walking slowly between pieces, headphones and nodding, whispering. Someone hugged me before I even made it through the door. "You made this," she said, beaming. "It feels like you." Another person said, "The way you use silence in your layouts. It's like a conversation I didn't know I needed." I smiled, but part of me was still scanning the room, waiting. And then there he was, Mason. He didn't walk in with a posse. He didn't demand attention. He just appeared in the back corner of the room, hands in his jacket pockets, staring at one of my earliest pieces. My breath caught in my throat. He hadn't RSVP'd. I hadn't invited him, but of course he came. Of course. I watched from across the room as he moved from piece to piece, his expression unreadable, posture stiff. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't touch a single drink, just observed, and then he looked up, saw me, our eyes locked. For a moment, everything fell silent, like we were back in that high school art room before all the tension, before the ego. Just two kids who loved shapes and color. He walked over. "Nice turnout," he said. I nodded. "Thanks for coming." He looked around. "This place, it's clean, minimal, very you." I wasn't sure if it was praise or preface. Then he pointed to one of the pieces, a grayscale collage of torn receipts and city maps overlain with handwritten text. "That one," he said. "I remember when you first started sketching that concept. You were unsure about it." I was. He looked at me again, and this time, it was different, less sharp, less guarded. "Looks like you figured it out." It took me a moment to respond. "Yeah," I said. I guess I stopped trying to sound like someone else and just started listening to myself. He flinched barely, but it was there. "I never meant to," he started. "I know I cut in gently, but you did." We stood there surrounded by my work, our history between us like glass. He glanced at the door. "Well, congrats. You made something." I nodded. "So can you." He didn't answer, just gave a half smile, then walked out. No scene, no final dig, just an ending, and it was enough. After the show, I stayed behind to help clean up. A few friends lingered, helping gather cups and fold tablecloths. One of them, Kira, clinked her glass with mine and said, "I've never seen you stand this tall before." I laughed. "I'm the same height." "You know what I mean." I did. That night back home, I opened my sketchbook again, but not to defend, not to respond, just to create. The first page was blank, but I didn't feel empty. I felt ready, because for the first time in years, I wasn't drawing in someone else's shadow. I was finally standing in my own light. The aftermath of the gallery show was quieter than I expected, not anticlimactic, just still, like the moment after a storm when the trees stop swaying and everything feels heavier, but also clearer. I didn't go viral. There was no sudden flood of commissions or book deals or agency offers. What I got instead was something better, peace, and respect, the kind that doesn't come with hashtags or applause but lingers in quiet DMs, thoughtful emails, and the way people start saying your name in rooms you're not in. The show had told my story, and for once I hadn't had to scream to be heard. A week later, I got a message from a small publishing imprint. They wanted to do a limited-run zine featuring some of my pieces and short essays on creative authenticity. It wasn't big money, but it was aligned. It felt like something real. I said, yes. That same week, I bumped into Mason again, not at a gallery or a networking event, but at a park. A totally ordinary Sunday morning. I was running with headphones and hoodie soaked, and there he was sitting on a bench, coffee and hand sketch pad on his lap. I almost kept running, but he saw me, nodded, and I stopped. He looked tired, not physically, but in a deeper way. That kind of emotional erosion that happens when you've been carrying the weight of your own story for too long, especially when you've told it so loudly that you can't revise it anymore. "Hey," I said. "Hey," he replied. I stood awkwardly. "Didn't expect to see you out here." He gestured to his sketch pad, needed a change of scenery. I nodded. Me too. There was a pause, not tense, just loaded. He broke it first. "I read your zine post," he said. "It's good. You wrote about influence and distance, the part about being raised near the same fire but not catching the same flame that hit. I was surprised. You read it." He gave a half smile. "I'm not the villain you think I am." I sat down next to him, not too close. "I don't think you're a villain, Mason. I think you're someone who didn't know how to share the light." He looked away. "Maybe." I waited. He tapped the edge of his sketch pad. "You know, there was a time when I really thought we'd build something together. Something big. And then, I don't know, I started feeling like you were running next to me, but not with me. And then you started pulling ahead. And I hated it. I appreciated the honesty, but I wasn't there to heal him. I never wanted to race you," I said. "I just wanted to grow, and I thought we could do that side by side." "Yeah, well," he muttered. "I wasn't built for side by side." That silence fell again. Then he said something that surprised me. "I'm sorry." I didn't know if I believed it, but I knew he meant it in the way someone can mean something, even when they don't fully understand the damage they caused. I nodded. "Thank you." We didn't say anything else after that. I stood, gave him a small wave, and jogged away. I didn't look back. A few days later, something strange happened. One of Mason's Instagram stories popped up on my feed, a muted black and white image of a broken billboard in the middle of a foggy road. Over it, he'd written, "Taking a step back. Been losing myself in noise. Time to rebuild." That was it. No tags, no drama, no passive shots fired, just distance. I didn't know if he'd meant it for me or for himself, but either way I respected it. I left it alone. That month I focused entirely on my next project, a private commission from a mental health nonprofit designing materials for youth outreach. It wasn't flashy, but it meant something, and that's where I wanted to stay. Meaning over mirrors, connection over competition. Late one night, while working on the layout for a digital campaign, I got a message from an old college professor, someone who'd always believed in me, even when I didn't. She'd seen the gallery photos online and said something that stopped me in my tracks. "Your voice finally caught up to your hands. Took a while, but it's yours now." It hit me harder than I expected, because for years that had been the question rattling in my mind. Do I even have my own voice? And the truth is, yes. But it took shedding the noise, the doubt, and the need for approval to finally hear it clearly. And now that I wasn't giving it up for anything. One night, I walked through the city alone, no destination, just movement, wind in my jacket, streetlights flickering overhead. I passed an old building where Mason and I once snuck in to tag a wall in college. The paint was long gone. The wall was blank now, clean. It made me smile. Because that was the thing about blank spaces, they weren't empty. They were invitations, and I was finally ready to accept. I didn't think I'd hear from Mason again after that morning in the park. His apology lingered in my mind like a song that fades out without ending, unresolved, unfinished, not quite satisfying, but no longer screaming. I had started to understand that not all stories need a final scene. Sometimes the best closure is the absence of another hit, but closure is a fragile thing. And Mason, he didn't stay quiet for long. It started small, a reel on Instagram, less than 10 seconds long. Just a screen recording of his latest design with the caption, "Crazy how the watered-down versions always get noticed first." No tags, no names. But I knew, and others knew too. 2 comments and someone had already replied, "Is this about Noah's stuff?" He didn't respond, but he liked the comment. That's all it took. My inbox started filling up again. Friends asking if I'd seen it. Followers sending screen recordings, others just checking in like I was supposed to break down every time he made a post. I didn't respond, but inside something cracked. Not because I needed his approval. I had outgrown that, but because I dared to believe he was finally stepping back. I'd believed the apology, the silence, the implied surrender. And now it felt like he just hit pause, waiting for me to let my guard down. And it worked, because I was angry, but I didn't rage post, I didn't rant. Instead, I opened my sketch pad and started designing. Not a campaign, not a commission, just something for me. It was a poster, black background, white type, one word in the middle, enough. Below it, in small letters, not louder, just clearer. I stared at it for a long time, then added it to a carousel post and hit share. The caption: there's a difference between growth and noise. One leaves roots, the other leaves smoke. No tags, no shade, just truth. Within an hour, my comment section exploded. Not in chaos and clarity, dozens of messages, not about Mason, not about the feud, but about people's own experiences, friends who became critics, supporters who turned sour the moment you started succeeding. One message read, "This hits deep. My own brother used to do this every time I won something. You're not alone." Another said, "You're showing us how to rise without pushing back." I didn't realize until then how many people had been quietly following the drama, and how many were rooting for me to take the high road, not to avoid confrontation, but to prove it could be done. But of course, Mason saw the post, because the next day he dropped a video. He sat in front of his camera, dimly lit room, moody music in the background, the kind of overproduced aesthetic he loved. He started calm. Some of you know there's been tension, misunderstandings, creative overlap. I've stayed quiet, but I think it's time I speak. He didn't say my name, but then he said this: I worked hard to build a voice, a style. And when someone comes along and starts walking, like you talking, like you designing, it gets in your head, you start questioning what's yours. And yeah, maybe I handled that badly, but I'm human. He paused. So if you're watching this and you think I'm talking about you, maybe ask why. That was the line that gutted me. Not because it hurt, but because it was manipulative. A final twist of the knife. He wanted to cast doubt not just on me, but on the narrative itself. He didn't want truth. He wanted confusion. But this time I didn't break. I didn't call him. I didn't comment. Instead, I posted a video of my own, but it wasn't a rebuttal. It was a process video of me in my apartment headphones and sketching the enough poster from scratch. I didn't speak once. Just let the pen move, 30 seconds, black and white, no voiceover, no music. And yet, it said everything. It got more views than anything I'd ever posted before. Not because of drama, because of clarity. A week later, a graphic design magazine reached out. They'd seen the video and wanted to feature me in a profile on authenticity and modern branding. They didn't mention Mason. They didn't ask about the feud. They asked about my work, my roots, my rhythm. And for the first time in years, I could answer without second-guessing myself. I told them everything, how I used to think growth meant catching up, how I believed closeness was proof of alignment, how I'd learned that sometimes the only way to respect someone is to walk away from them. The piece was published 2 weeks later. It was titled "Voice Without Permission." That headline, it stayed with me, because that's what it was in the end. Not revenge, not vindication, just the quiet, undeniable act of claiming space, not borrowed, not echoed, mine. If I've learned anything about survival, it's this: the second you stop reacting, you start creating again. After the article dropped, I didn't hear from Mason. No cryptic tweets, no low blows, no just wandering DMs from mutual friends fishing for details. Just silence. And that silence wasn't awkward or heavy. It was like someone turned off a machine that had been humming in the background of my life for years. Suddenly I had room to think, to breathe, to build. I dove into work not as an escape, but as a return. Designing for nonprofits, mentoring a couple of junior designers online, and even teaching a short design class at a local community center. The more I poured into others, the more my own clarity grew. I wasn't interested in proving anything anymore. And because of that, my work evolved. It stopped trying to impress. It started to express. Then came something unexpected, a message from a name I hadn't seen in a long time, Amira, one of Mason's exes. We'd only met once at a party years ago, where Mason introduced her to me with a weird edge in his voice, like he was showing off a trophy. Back then, she'd said little, smiled politely, and disappeared early. But now she was in my inbox. "Hey, sorry if this is weird, but I just read the magazine piece. I wanted to say thank you. I dated Mason for 3 years and saw what you went through up close. You handled it with more grace than I ever could. Just thank you for putting it into words. I stared at the message. I hadn't written the article with vengeance in mind. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't a weapon, but it had spoken to people who had lived inside someone else's gravity for too long. I replied simply, "Thank you for saying that. I hope you're doing better now." She responded almost immediately, "I am, and I'm creating again too." Took a long time, but I found my way back. That line, "I found my way back," stayed with me, because that's what all of this had been. Not a feud, not a rivalry, just a long painful journey back to myself. But not everyone saw it that way. One morning, I woke up to a thread on a design forum titled, "Is there such a thing as quiet theft in the creative world?" The post was vague but not subtle. It quoted lines from the magazine profile, dissecting them as carefully crafted manipulation. The poster suggested that some creatives weaponize empathy to build a brand while quietly stealing from others. I knew it was about me, and I knew who had posted it. The account was anonymous, but the phrasing, the tone, it was Mason's voice, even without the name attached. Old me would have spiraled. Old me would have written paragraphs defending myself, pulling receipts, breaking down my version, histories proving beyond doubt that my work was original. But I didn't do that. Instead, I logged off the forum, closed the tab, took a walk. Because here's the thing, truth doesn't need to chase echoes, it stands. And the people who needed to know, the clients, the collaborators, the community I'd built slowly and deliberately, they already knew who I was. They saw it not in statements, but in consistency. They saw it in how I showed up day after day with steady hands and a quiet voice that didn't have to fight for attention anymore. Later that week, I was invited to speak at a creative panel hosted by a design school in the city. The topic was identity and influence. I almost said no, but then I thought about the students, the ones just starting out, the ones still figuring out where inspiration ends and identity begins. "So?" I said. I said yes. The room was filled with young faces, open notebooks, and nervous energy. I remembered being one of them, unsure if my voice was valid, if my work was mine, enough to matter. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about Mason. I didn't mention betrayal or drama. I just told the truth, about how I used to shrink myself to fit into someone else's comfort zone, about how I used to erase my instincts fearing they'd be seen as imitation, about how I almost quit not because I lacked skill, but because I lacked permission, until one day I realized I didn't need it. Silence fell in the room when I finished. Then someone raised their hand. "Do you think influence is theft?" I thought for a moment. "No," I said. "Influence is natural. It's how we grow. But when someone accuses you of stealing without looking at why they feel threatened, that's not about you. That's about their fear." Another student asked, "How do you protect your voice?" I smiled. "You use it every day, even when it trembles." Afterward, a handful of students came up to thank me. One said, "You made me feel okay about not being the loudest in the room." That moment, that one sentence felt more valuable than any viral post ever had. As I walked home that night, the city hummed softly around me, streetlights blinking, the wind cool against my skin. I passed a building under renovation, its side covered in scaffolding and graffiti. One line caught my eye, spray painted in black, "Real things grow in silence." I stood there for a minute, letting it sink in, because that's what this journey had been all along. Not a war, not a drama, just a slow, painful, beautiful act of growing even in the shadow of someone else's noise. And finally, I wasn't in that shadow anymore. I was in the light. By the time fall came around, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to wait for the next hit. There was no tension under my skin when I opened Instagram. No scanning captions for subtext, no holding my breath every time a mutual posted. I wasn't living in anticipation of a jab or a shadow. Instead, I was living in something new, stability. And in that stability, my work began to stretch in unexpected ways. I found myself experimenting again with shapes, with texture, with silence. I created pieces that didn't sell but meant something to me. I collaborated with people I used to be intimidated by, and I laughed more full laughs, not the polite ones I used to give when Mason made those cutting jokes and I didn't want to seem sensitive. Then one day, I got a call. Blocked number. I almost didn't answer, but something in me said, "Do it." "Hello." There was a pause, then a voice I knew far too well. Noah, Mason. I froze. He sounded different, softer, like someone who hadn't slept. "I know I shouldn't be calling," he said quickly, "but I needed to talk to you, in person." I didn't answer. He continued, not to fight, not to explain, just to say some things I should have said a long time ago. Every instinct in me said to hang up, but another part, the quieter part, said, closure is a door you don't always get to close twice. So I said, okay. We met at a quiet cafe, the same one where we used to sketch ideas on napkins before either of us had real clients. When I walked in, he was already there, hoodie pulled low, tapping his fingers on the table. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but like time had peeled back the arrogance and left something raw behind. He stood when he saw me. No games, I said. You have 10 minutes. He nodded, and then slowly he began. I saw the panel, he said. At Parsons, someone posted a clip. You said some people accuse others of stealing because they're scared of what it says about their own work. That line. He shook his head. It gutted me. I stayed silent. He looked up at me. You weren't wrong. I was scared. The more you grew, the more I felt like I was disappearing, like there was only so much space in the world for people like us and you were taking it. He swallowed. But you didn't take anything. I gave mine away. I stopped evolving. I stopped listening. I built a throne out of insecurity and expected you to bow to it. I blinked. He went on. I was jealous, yeah, but it was deeper than that. I think I saw parts of me in you that I had buried, that softer rhythm, that patience, that restraint. I mocked it because I didn't understand it, because I couldn't do it. Still I said nothing. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice shaking. I've lost a lot this year. Friends, clients, myself mostly. I've been seeing a therapist, trying to figure out where I went wrong. Another deep breath. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not here to rewrite history. I needed to look you in the eye and say it. And for the first time since everything had started, since the jabs, the silence, the public shade. Mason went quiet, really quiet, no posturing, no performance, just silence. I looked at him, this person who had once been my best friend, my creative partner, the mirror I measured myself against for far too long, and I felt calm, not pity, not anger, just clarity. I nodded slowly. Thank you for saying that. He exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for years. We sat there a moment longer, the weight between us finally dissolving. Then he stood. I'll leave you alone now. He turned to go, but I stopped him with one final sentence. I hope you find your voice again. He paused, then nodded and walked out, and I knew in that moment that was the real ending. Not the confrontation, not the post, not the silence, but this. Two people who had once grown beside each other finally growing apart without needing to pull each other down. That night, I went home and opened my email. Sitting in my inbox was a message from a creative residency in Berlin. They'd seen my panel, followed my recent projects, and wanted to offer me a 3-month spot next spring. Time, space, stillness, a chance to create without noise. I accepted without hesitation. Then I opened a fresh canvas and wrote 3 words at the top in bold hand-drawn letters. This is mine. Not because I'd earned it by winning, not because someone else lost, but because I'd kept going, because I'd stopped shrinking, because I'd stopped asking. And finally, after all this time, I had stopped designing in reaction to someone else. I was just designing, just being. The residency in Berlin came at the perfect time. 3 months in a converted warehouse turned creative loft, with tall windows, creaking wood floors, and silence that wrapped around you like a second skin. It didn't buzz like the city back home, it breathed. There were 12 of us, writers, illustrators, musicians, ceramicists. Everyone carried their own rhythm, their own language. No one asked about follower counts, no one compared portfolios. We just made things. And in that space, I began to rediscover something I hadn't felt in years, wonder. I walked every morning, down narrow cobblestone alleys, through parks where old men played chess under rust-colored trees. I spent afternoons in bookstores, leafing through European design books I couldn't even read, but still somehow understood. My hands began to create without hesitation again, not to prove, not to defend, just to express. By the end of the first month, I'd completed 6 new pieces, bolder, freer, and more tactile than anything I'd done before. They were raw and imperfect, and I loved them. My project for the residency became something unexpected, a visual journal titled Echoes I No Longer Answer. Each page was a piece inspired by a moment I'd once allowed to define me. The first time, Mason called me a copycat. The time I changed an entire client design just to avoid being accused of mimicry. The time I stayed silent when I should have said, "That's mine." The moment I let myself believe I was only good if he said so. Each piece told that story not with anger, but with release. And when I laid them all out for the open studio showcase, I didn't feel fear, I felt peace. The final page was just text, no design, no image, just as you don't need to raise your voice when you've learned to trust your own. The day before I flew home, I got an email from an editor at a creative arts journal. She had attended the open showcase and she wanted to publish the entire visual journal as a limited run collection. "Your work feels like a quiet rebellion," she wrote. "Exactly what we need right now." That sentence undid me, not because it was flattery, because for the first time someone saw my silence not as absence or weakness, but as defiance, a choice, a truth, a power. Coming back to the city was like stepping into a louder version of myself. Everything was faster, sharper, brighter. I had to adjust. But I came back different, more rooted, less reactive. My boundaries now had depth, not just edges. I reconnected with a few friends, took on new clients, not the biggest names, but the ones that aligned with my values. And then one evening, scrolling through my feed, I saw Mason again. Not a post, not a story, an announcement. He was launching a mentorship program for young designers focused on identity, originality, and healing the creative ego. I blinked, not in disbelief, but in awe. Because here's the truth, people don't always stay the villain. Sometimes they grow too. I clicked through, read every word. His tone was different now, less performative, more grounded. He spoke about humility, about the damage of competition culture, about unlearning what success looks like when you've been taught to stand alone. I didn't message him, I didn't reshare, but I felt something loosen in me. Like a knot I didn't know I was still carrying had finally unraveled, because I realized I didn't need him to disappear for me to thrive. I just needed him to no longer define me. That week I was invited back to Parsons for another panel, this time as a keynote. The theme was finding your voice in a world of noise. I stood on stage in front of 200 students, palms slightly damp, heart steady, and I told them everything, not just the story of Mason, not just the art, but the fear of not being enough, the fear of sounding like someone else, the fear of being invisible or worse, unoriginal. And then I told them the truth I'd earned with blood, silence, and ink. You are not a copy just because someone else sees themselves in your growth. You are not a threat because your voice rises, and you are allowed to take up space even if the person next to you built the floor. When I stepped down, dozens of students came to me with questions, a few with tears. One, a nervous boy with ink-stained fingers, handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a note. "Your story sounds like mine." I thought I was crazy. "Thank you for showing me I'm not." I kept that note. It now hangs in my studio, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of reclamation. I used to think Mason stole something from me, my confidence, my originality, my voice. But the truth is, he didn't steal anything. I gave it away, piece by piece, trying to earn his approval, fit into his framework at his pace. But I took it back, not with a fight, with quiet clarity, and that's a kind of revenge louder than any scream. There's a certain kind of silence that only arrives when you've said everything you need to say, not out loud, but in the choices you make, the spaces you no longer enter, and the versions of yourself you no longer apologize for. That silence, I live in it now. It isn't lonely, it's spacious. When I walk into my studio every morning, I don't think about Mason. I don't measure the angles of my creativity against his. I don't feel the need to anticipate his reactions or preemptively shift my ideas to dodge imaginary comparisons. I just create. Sometimes it's messy, sometimes it's simple, sometimes it looks nothing like anything I've done before, and for once I don't panic that someone will say, "That's not your style," because I no longer need to have one single style to be valid. I just need to be honest. A few weeks after my second keynote at Parsons, I got an unexpected email from Mason. It was short, 3 lines. "I saw your talk. You're right. I did let my ego eat everything good. I'm still learning, but I'm trying. Thank you for being honest, even when I couldn't. Wishing you better days than I ever gave you." I read it once, twice, and then I closed it. I didn't respond, not because I was bitter, but because there was nothing more to say. Some stories don't end with reconciliation. They end with release. Now, I teach a monthly workshop called Design Without Permission. It's full of students, freelancers, and creators trying to find themselves in an industry that tells them to be louder, faster, more marketable. We don't talk about trends, we talk about truth. And every time someone asks me, how do I know if what I'm doing is original? I tell them this: if you had no audience, no algorithm, no competition, would you still make it? Would it still matter to you? If the answer is yes, it's yours. That always lands the same way. A silence falls, the same kind of silence that once scared me. Now I live in it like a house I built with my own hands. The gallery that once hosted my unborrowed show invited me back this year for a follow-up. They said the first exhibit still gets mentioned quietly in late conversations, by people who felt seen but never said much out loud. I titled the new one, The Quiet Bloom, because that's what this has been all along, a slow, silent unfolding, a growth no longer stunted by shadow. I still keep that piece on my wall, the one that just says, enough. I don't look at it often, but on the days when doubt returns, and it always does in small, clever ways, I glance at it. And I remember the boy who used to delete his best ideas because he was afraid of being too close to someone else's. I remember the young man who tried to shrink himself to fit into a friendship that didn't have room for his light. And then I remember who I am now, not a copy, not a reflection, not someone who finally found his voice. No, someone who always had it. He just stopped whispering. If you've ever felt like you are living in someone else's shadow, if someone's made you feel like your growth is threatening or your style isn't yours, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not owe anyone your silence. You do not need permission to take up space. You do not need to dim so someone else can shine. You are not too late. You are not a copy. You are not small. You are becoming. And the ones who matter will see it not because you shout, but because you stay. You keep building. You keep showing up. You keep being you. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of someone you used to be, share your story in the comments. You never know who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about quiet strength identity and the kind of revenge that doesn't need noise to leave an impact, subscribe to Ethan's Way. Your voice matters here, and I promise you're not alone anymore.